In this episode, we are moving into one of the most practical tools in the entire CRISC journey, because once an organization begins identifying risks, someone has to capture them in a way that supports real decisions instead of letting them disappear into meeting notes, memory, or scattered reports. That tool is the Information Technology (IT) Risk Register, which is a structured record of identified risks and the key information needed to understand, monitor, and manage them over time. For a brand new learner, this can sound like a spreadsheet topic rather than a serious risk topic, but that would miss the point. A good risk register is not just a place where risks are stored. It is one of the main ways an organization turns risk awareness into accountability, prioritization, communication, and action. Once you understand that, the risk register becomes much more than paperwork. It becomes a living view of where the organization is exposed, what is being done about it, and which issues deserve leadership attention before they grow into real business harm. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful place to begin is with what a risk register actually is. At its core, it is a documented collection of risk entries that describes identified risks in a consistent and reviewable way so the organization can see them clearly, compare them, assign ownership, and track what happens next. Each entry typically captures enough information to explain what the risk is, why it matters, what causes it, what area of the business or technology environment it affects, what controls exist, and what response is planned or already underway. A beginner might imagine it as a long list of bad things, but a good register is more structured than that. It exists so risks are described in a form that supports management, not just awareness. Without a register, risk discussions often become fragmented. People raise concerns in isolation, teams focus on local issues, and important exposure may remain visible only to a few individuals instead of being managed in a coordinated and transparent way across the organization. One of the biggest lessons to understand early is that the register is not the same thing as the risks themselves. The risk exists in the business and technology environment whether the organization writes it down or not. The register is the mechanism for making that risk visible, understandable, and governable. This matters because some organizations become overly focused on maintaining the document while forgetting the purpose behind it. The goal is not to create a perfect administrative artifact. The goal is to support better risk decisions by giving the organization a clear and current record of its most important exposures. If a risk is entered into the register but never reviewed, never assigned, and never connected to action, then the existence of the entry has not created much value. On the other hand, when the register is used well, it helps leadership see patterns, helps owners stay accountable, and helps the organization avoid the false comfort of believing that recognized risk is the same thing as managed risk. A strong IT risk register begins with high-quality risk identification, because weak input will always produce a weak register no matter how polished the format appears. Risks may be identified through assessments, audits, incident reviews, project work, technology change, control testing, vendor oversight, business interviews, or scenario analysis. The important point is that entries should reflect meaningful risks grounded in the organization's real environment rather than vague statements or generic security concerns copied from a template. A strong risk entry usually explains a credible condition that could create harm to a business objective, process, system, service, or data set. If the description is too broad, such as cyber risk to systems, it does not support action very well. If it is too narrow, it may become unusable as soon as one technical detail changes. Good register entries sit at a level where the organization can understand the exposure, compare it with others, assign ownership, and discuss treatment options in a practical way. That leads naturally to the idea of standard fields, because consistency is one of the main things that makes a register useful. If one risk entry is described in business terms, another in technical jargon, and a third as a vague complaint about process weakness, the organization will struggle to compare them or decide which deserves the most attention. A useful register usually captures a risk statement, business area or asset affected, likely cause or threat source, vulnerability or condition involved, current controls, inherent and residual assessment where the organization uses those concepts, owner, plan treatment, status, and review information. The exact format can vary, but the principle stays the same. Each entry should provide enough clarity that a reader can understand the exposure without needing to track down the original author for explanation. For beginners, this is a key idea. The register is valuable because it turns scattered concern into structured information, and structure is what allows risk conversations to become more disciplined and less dependent on memory, interpretation, or personal style. Risk statements themselves deserve careful attention because the quality of the register depends heavily on how clearly each entry explains the problem. A strong statement usually connects a condition to a possible business consequence. That might mean describing how dependence on a single provider could disrupt a critical service, how weak access review could allow inappropriate access to sensitive data, or how poor change control could introduce instability into an essential platform. The point is to show what could happen and why it matters, not just to name a technical weakness in isolation. A beginner will often be tempted to write risks as brief labels, but labels are not enough. Missing patch management, inadequate training, or vendor dependence may all be real concerns. Yet without context, they do not explain the path to harm or the business meaning of the exposure. The stronger the statement, the easier it becomes to assign ownership, evaluate severity, compare it with related entries, and decide what treatment makes the most sense. Ownership is one of the most important fields in the register because a risk without an owner is usually a risk that will drift, age, or remain unresolved longer than it should. The owner should be a person or role with enough business understanding and enough authority to make or influence decisions about the exposure. This does not mean the owner personally performs every mitigation task. It means the owner is accountable for making sure the risk is understood, reviewed, escalated when needed, and treated in a way that aligns with business priorities and governance expectations. The register makes this visible by showing who is responsible for each entry rather than leaving accountability vague. For a new learner, this is one of the biggest practical values of the register. It turns general awareness into named responsibility. Once that happens, risk management becomes easier to sustain because entries are less likely to become anonymous concerns living only in governance documents while no one actively drives decisions about whether the exposure remains acceptable. Assessment information also plays a central role in the risk register because leaders need some way to understand relative significance. Different organizations use different methods, but most try to capture some view of likelihood, impact, severity, or overall rating so risks can be compared and prioritized. Some also distinguish between inherent risk, meaning the exposure before considering controls, and residual risk, meaning the exposure that remains after existing controls are taken into account. The exact scoring model matters less than the discipline of being consistent and thoughtful. A weak assessment model can create false precision, where numbers look authoritative even though the underlying judgment was rushed or unsupported. A stronger approach uses scoring to support conversation rather than replace it. For beginners, the main lesson is that rating a risk is not about winning an argument with a number. It is about helping the organization understand which risks deserve the most urgent attention, which may be acceptable for now, and where additional evidence or leadership review may be required before the right decision becomes clear. Current controls and treatment plans make the register far more useful because they connect risk awareness to real management activity. If an entry simply states that a risk exists, the organization still does not know whether controls are already reducing that risk or whether further action is needed. A good register therefore shows what safeguards, reviews, practices, or governance mechanisms are already in place, and then indicates what additional response is planned if the remaining exposure is still too high. That response might involve mitigation, transfer, acceptance, avoidance, or some combination shaped by the organization's risk tolerance and practical realities. The important point is that the register should not stop at identifying the problem. It should also show the path the organization is taking in response. For a CRISC learner, this is where the register becomes much more than a catalog. It becomes a management tool that links risk entries to decisions, budgets, deadlines, responsible parties, and follow up expectations rather than leaving them as static observations. Maintaining the register is just as important as establishing it, because a register that is not kept current quickly loses value. New systems are introduced, controls improve, incidents occur, vendors change, projects alter the environment, and business priorities shift. All of that means risks can emerge, grow, shrink, split, combine, or become irrelevant over time. A stale register may still look organized, but it can mislead leadership badly if it reflects an older environment rather than current reality. This is why maintenance is not a clerical afterthought. It is part of risk governance. Entries should be reviewed periodically, updated when treatment actions change, revised after incidents or assessments, and removed or retired when the underlying condition no longer exists. For beginners, this is a very important point. The register is only as useful as it is current. If nobody is refreshing it, validating it, or challenging outdated entries, then the organization may begin making decisions based on a risk picture that no longer matches the world it is operating in today. Review cadence matters because not every risk changes at the same speed, yet every risk should be reviewed often enough that important changes are not missed. High-priority risks, fast-changing technology exposures, major project-related risks, and issues tied to external providers or regulatory expectations may deserve more frequent review than slower-moving concerns. The specific timetable can vary, but the principle is that the organization should not wait for annual planning cycles to notice that a material change has occurred. A control may have failed, a vendor may have altered a service model, a system may have become business-critical, or a treatment plan may have stalled without anyone escalating the delay. A good maintenance approach creates regular opportunities to confirm whether the description, rating, ownership, treatment status, and residual exposure still make sense. For someone new to this area, it helps to think of the register as an instrument panel rather than a filing cabinet. It should show what leadership and owners need to see now, not what was true when the entry was first recorded. Quality control is another important part of maintenance because the register can become cluttered or confusing if entries are not reviewed for clarity, duplication, and usefulness. Over time, organizations may accumulate overlapping risks written by different teams in different language, which makes the register harder to interpret and weaker as a governance tool. Some entries may drift into control issues rather than true risk statements, while others may remain so vague that nobody can tell what action they imply. Good governance includes checking whether entries are still clearly stated, whether multiple entries should be consolidated, whether ownership remains valid, and whether the level of detail is consistent across the register. This is not about making the document look tidy for its own sake. It is about ensuring that the register remains readable, comparable, and decision-ready. For beginners, this matters because a crowded or inconsistent register can create the illusion of visibility while actually making it harder for the organization to identify which exposures are most meaningful and what must happen next. The register also becomes much more powerful when it supports communication upward and outward. Senior leaders, governance bodies, auditors, and risk committees often do not need every technical detail of every entry, but they do need a dependable view of major exposures, trends, ownership, treatment progress, and areas where residual risk may exceed comfort levels. The register supports that by serving as a source of truth from which summaries, dashboards, and discussion materials can be drawn. It also helps ensure that different reports are grounded in the same underlying information rather than each team presenting its own disconnected version of the risk picture. A beginner should understand that the register is not only an internal working tool for risk practitioners. It is also a communication bridge between operational detail and executive oversight. When used well, it helps leaders ask better questions, allocate attention more intelligently, and avoid surprises that occur when important risks were visible somewhere in the organization but not surfaced in a way decision-makers could act on. Several common mistakes weaken risk registers and make them far less useful than they should be. One mistake is treating the register as a one-time project created for an audit, assessment, or presentation and then largely abandoned. Another is filling it with risks that are too generic, too technical, or too poorly written to support meaningful action. Some organizations also confuse issues, controls, incidents, and risks so badly that the register becomes a mixed file of unrelated concerns instead of a clear record of exposure. Others fail to assign ownership clearly or allow treatment dates to pass without review or escalation. There is also a tendency to make the register either too large and crowded to manage well or too selective in a way that hides important exposure. These problems matter because the register is supposed to improve visibility and discipline, not create more confusion. A weak register can actually reduce confidence in the risk program by making it harder for people to see what is important and whether management is truly in control of the situation. A simple example can help bring all of this together. Imagine an organization depends heavily on a third-party cloud platform to support customer onboarding, identity verification, and document processing. A meaningful entry in the register would not merely say vendor risk exists. It would describe how dependence on that platform could disrupt customer onboarding if the provider experiences an outage or control failure, identify the business service affected, note the current controls such as contract oversight and service monitoring, assign a business owner for the risk, record the treatment actions such as improving fallback procedures or strengthening vendor review, and show the current status and remaining exposure. If the provider later changes its architecture, experiences a service issue, or becomes more deeply integrated into core operations, the entry should be reviewed and updated to reflect the new conditions. That example shows why the register matters. It turns a broad concern into a structured and maintainable record that supports real management rather than leaving the issue as a general warning people remember only when a disruption already begins. When you step back and look at the full picture, establishing and maintaining the IT risk register becomes much easier to see as one of the central disciplines that keeps risk management organized, visible, and accountable over time. The register captures meaningful risk entries in a consistent form, links them to ownership and treatment, supports prioritization, and provides a current view of where exposure remains across the organization's technology and business environment. Its value comes not from the existence of a document, but from the clarity, discipline, maintenance, and communication it supports. For a new learner, the most important takeaway is that a strong risk register helps the organization move from scattered awareness to structured action. It makes risk easier to compare, easier to govern, and harder to ignore. When maintained well, it becomes one of the clearest indicators that the organization is not merely talking about risk, but is actively managing it in a way that supports better decisions before uncertainty turns into damage.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.